Hi everyone, this is the first of a series of sermons for snowbirds. We're going to be rebroadcasting the previous week's sermons at TBDJ on the internet for everyone who missed it. This particular week there aren't a lot of snowbirds out in Florida, but we did have a lot of people who weren't in the synagogue because there were a variety of kiddushes and simchas in other synagogues, and so we're rebroadcasting the previous week's sermon. And so here it is. And I'll begin first with a quote from Samuel Pepys, the famous English diarist, who writes about a visit to a synagogue in London in the year 1663, where he goes one evening and he surveys what's going on in the synagogue. He writes about it in his diary, and at the very end he writes like this: "But Lord, to see the disorder, laughing, sporting, and no attention, but confusion in all their service, more like brutes than people knowing the true God." He says, "I could never have imagined there had been any religion in the whole world so absurdly performed as this." So on October 14th, 1663, one evening, Samuel Pepys visits a synagogue in London. He goes there. He says, "I'm never going back. They serve God like a bunch of brutes. Everything is disorderly. There's a lot of noise. There's a lack of decorum." Now, of course, it needs to be mentioned that Pepys happened to have gone to synagogue the evening of Simchat Torah. But I think many of us recognize that if Samuel Pepys would walk into most Orthodox synagogues in North America on any given Shabbat, he wouldn't have a lot of nice things to write about it either. Our synagogues lack a great deal of decorum. Now, in actuality, the problem of decorum is an old one. It has a long history, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. Even in the 1200s, Rabbi Yitzchak of Courbet, one of the most prominent French Rishonim, a son-in-law of Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, Rabbi Yitzchak of Courbet, or otherwise known as the Smak, the author of the Smak, writes this at the end of Mitzvah Yud Aleph. He writes, he says, "What a woe to those who speak in the synagogue empty matters or make jokes and lightness of head." And then he continues on and he says, we have to make a kal v'chomer. We have to infer that if you look at what happens with all of the local Christians, when they go to their churches, they sit there mute, silent as if they were mutes, and they say no words. And he says, we certainly, who sit before the Melech Malchei Amlachim, the King of Kings, we should be incredibly quiet in our synagogues. Now, this is a matter that has a history of hundreds of years talking in the synagogue. If you go forward a few hundred years, it's interesting, about 2-3 weeks ago, someone in the synagogue brought to me a mishaberach, a prayer that was said specifically for those who don't speak in the synagogue. Now, this particular mishaberach, which was written by Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Heller, the Tosfos Yom Tov, he wrote it in the year 1650, after the Gezerot Tach V'Tat, after the Cossack massacres in the year 1648 and 1649. And he was looking for a way for the community to do tshuva. So he wanted to encourage people to repent. And what was their manner of repentance? By no longer speaking in the synagogue. And one has to recognize that when you have a particular prayer praising those who don't speak in the synagogue, it means that speaking in the synagogue is the norm, and not speaking is what's unusual. Now, if you advance forward a few hundred years later, if you look at Leon Jick's The Americanization of the Synagogue, 1820 to 1870, which is one of the great historical works on the North American synagogue. And Jick, who was a Reform rabbi and an historian, he writes that very often reformers, when they came into a community, one of the primary planks in their platform was decorum in the synagogue. That many of those who went to synagogue, young Americans, felt that if they would bring one of their non-Jewish friends to synagogue, they would be humiliated by the manner that synagogue was conducted and the lack of decorum that was found inside the synagogue. And so for hundreds of years we've been having a problem with decorum. Now, the problem with decorum is to some extent understandable. First of all, the problem with decorum has its roots in a problem with kavanah, with having proper intention during the prayers. Now, having intention during the prayers, as Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz explains in his commentary to the Rambam, means two things. When we talk about kavanah, when we talk about focus, we're talking about, first of all, understanding the words, of course. Do I know what the words mean? When I say, Mashiv haruach morid hageshem, may the wind blow and may rain fall, do I understand what the words actually mean? That's one thing. But there's a more basic and more important kavanah, Rav Chaim notes, without which you truly haven't prayed. And that is the kavanah, that is the intention that you're standing before God. How many of us come to synagogue, sit there for 2 or 3 hours, and not for one moment actually focus on the prayers? Not only do we not focus on the prayers, we don't even focus on the fact that we are meant to be standing before God. Now, if we think that issues with kavanah are new, if you take a look at the Talmud Yerushalmi, and here we're going to be dealing with a group of 3rd century sages, we're going to be dealing with a group of statements made nearly 1800 years ago. The Talmud Yerushalmi brings down a series of rabbis talking about their own lack of kavanah, their own lack of intention. So it starts out with a statement by Rav Yirmiyah who says that if you prayed but didn't have kavanah, you didn't have focus, if you know that you can pray again and the second time have kavanah, then by all means repeat it. But if you won't, do not repeat the prayer. And then the Yerushalmi continues onward. It starts out first with a statement by the great Rav Chia. Rav Chia says that in my entire life, I never had intention except for one time, where one time I actually thought in my heart, I'm standing before God, I'm standing before a minister, I may even be standing before the Reish Galuta. In other words, he actually stood there only once, recognizing that standing before God should be on par with standing before the king or before the minister. Only one time did he actually have that particular feeling. Now, if you think that that's just an isolated statement, the Talmud continues. Shmuel says, when I was praying, I would count birds. Rav Bon or Rav Avon said, and this is Rav Chia's son, he said that when I would pray, I would count bricks. Rav Masnaya says, I have to thank my head, because when I would get to Modim, to the part of the prayer where you bow for Modim, he says, I have to thank my head because my head would bow on its own without me thinking about it. The problem of not having kavanah, not having intention, is not a new problem. It's an old problem. And it's part of the decorum problem. Very often we can come to synagogue and not focus on what we need to be doing. But it's tragic that there are so many of us that can come to synagogue day in and day out, week in and week out, spend hours upon hours supposedly praying, and not for 1 minute recognize that we're standing before God. But there's another root to this particular problem of decorum, and that has to do with the sanctity of the synagogue. Now, as the Gemara in Megillah explains, the synagogue is supposed to be a sacred place. It's sacred ground. Human beings have appointed places that they treat with unique holiness. The temple in Jerusalem, which was such an overwhelming place. It was grand, it was large, it was big, it was filled with thousands of people, was the sort of place that felt sacred just by walking in there. The very holiness permeated the entire place. Now the Talmud in Megillah says, based on the verse in Sefer Yecheskel in the book of Ezekiel, the Talmud in Megillah says that every synagogue is a mikdash ma'at, a small temple, a small sanctuary. We are meant to treat the synagogue as sacred a place as we treat the temple. Now that's what a synagogue should be. And if you had that feeling when you walked in, it would be filled with decorum. The problem is this. As the synagogue is made into a place of God, a house of worship, a house of God, it also is made into a Beit Knesset, a house of gathering. The synagogue requires a minyan, it requires 10, it requires people to come together, and indeed it is a house of the community. So much so that on the very next page in the Talmud, in Megillah, the Talmud says that the Bate Knesiot Shebebavel al Tnai Heim Asuyin, that actually all of the synagogues in Babylonia and Chutz La'aretz outside of Israel are made conditionally. What does it mean that they're made conditionally? It means that they're sacred when you pray there. After you're done with the prayer, you can eat there, you can do all sorts of other things there. I mean, there's actually a lot of halachic discussion, but you can do other uses in the synagogue. The synagogue is not strictly a house of prayer. It also can be used for secular purposes as well. And this is a remarkable idea. The idea that a synagogue is not just a place of prayer and a place of worship, it is also a place of community. And because the synagogue is a dual-use place, we find it difficult sometimes to actually respect it with the proper decorum. You know, the American humorist Harry Golden used to tell a story about his father. Harry Golden would say that his father was an avowed atheist, yet his father would go to synagogue every week. So when he was a teenager, Harry Golden went to his father and said, "Dad, you're an atheist. Why are you going to synagogue?" So his father pointed to the Jewish gentleman who lived across the street from them, and he said, "You see, across the street, Harry, there's Mr. Garfinkel, yes? Mr. Garfinkel is a very pious man, yes? Garfinkel goes to the synagogue to speak to God. I go to the synagogue to speak to Garfinkel." And this is, I think, one of the reasons why our synagogues don't have decorum, because really, in some sense, it's not just the house of God. It's the house of the Jewish people. It's the house of the community. It's the house of Knesset in which we gather both the community and God together. But the real issue, and I think perhaps the most profound issue, that keeps us from finding decorum in the synagogue is culture. You know, there's a joke that Rabbi Zalman Meltzer used to tell. It's sort of an insider football joke because you have to know all of the different customs of the synagogue. But there's a prayer called Av HaRachamim that Ashkenazic Jews say on every Shabbat morning, which actually commemorates the Crusades. And Av HaRachamim is generally omitted on a Shabbat in which they begin to bless the new month, their new moon. So there's, however, one or two Shabbatot in the year in which we actually say Av HaRachamim, in the new months of Iyar and Sivan. But there's always a little bit of a confusion whether you do or you don't, and there's always a bit of a disagreement. So the joke told Rav Zalman Meltzer is that someone came to him and said, "What's the custom? What do we do with Av HaRachamim on the beginning of the month of Iyar? Do we say it or do we not say it?" So Rav Zalman Meltzer famously said, some have the custom to say Av HaRachamim, some don't have the custom to say Av HaRachamim, but everybody has the custom to fight about it. What Rav Zalman Meltzer was telling us is about culture. The culture of the synagogue can determine whether or not it's a place of speaking or a place that's not speaking. And you know, it's interesting, in our own synagogue, we've seen this ourselves. We had a parallel service on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in which there was an insistence that this be a service that's filled with decorum, that people not speak during the service. Now, the very same people who upstairs on a regular Shabbat may speak, they went downstairs to the decorum service, and all of a sudden, they found a way to keep silent. But amazingly enough, after they've returned upstairs, after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they figured out how to speak in synagogue again. Remarkable. But actually, this change, this transformation of upstairs, downstairs, of how people can change when they're in the service upstairs and then when they're in the service downstairs in the same building, in the same synagogue, speaks to the concept of culture. The reason why there is so much speaking in our synagogues is because our culture allows it and even encourages it. Yes, it's important to say hello to new faces, but that doesn't require for you to have a lengthy conversation and discourse on the stock market with your neighbor. You don't need to catch up on all the news and gossip in Montreal just in middle of Kriyat HaTorah in the Torah reading. And that's the issue of culture. How do we break the culture? How do we reset the culture? It's not an easy question to answer. It's very difficult, in fact, to figure out how we reset cultures. Everybody all over the world in multiple contexts and situations look at certain cultures and say, we've got to change this. But there are two thoughts I want to leave you with. The first is that it's tragic. It's tragic if people spend 3 hours on a Shabbat morning in a synagogue and not once think that they're standing before God. Everybody, when they walk into the synagogue, should say to themselves, there's a certain moment that I'm going to make certain that at least for that minute, 1 minute, I will be truly praying and standing before God. That's one suggestion. But the other suggestion goes to what a wonderful synagogue in New York, the Young Israel of Woodmere, has done. The Young Israel of Woodmere, several years ago, under the leadership of its entire rabbinic staff, decided they had to turn things around. The situation in the synagogue had gotten so bad that actually people were taking simchas, were taking bar mitzvahs out of the synagogue because they were embarrassed to have their friends and family there. They were embarrassed by the noise. So what they did is they began to circulate a pledge for decorum. And at first a few people signed, and then a few more. 100 became 200, became 500, became 1,000. And after a while, the problem didn't only disappear, it totally reversed itself. And it became a synagogue renowned for their decorum. I think this is possible for us as well. We have to figure out how to hit the reset button in our culture. But we have to recognize that our synagogue, as much as it's a place of gathering, it's also a sacred place. And if we don't feel the presence of God in the synagogue, where will we feel it? So we need to turn around. We have to say to ourselves, we want to pray. We want to pray, and we want to treat our synagogue with respect. And I think if we do that, we can turn our synagogue around as well and hit the reset button. Shabbat Shalom.